Before we get started, I want to acknowledge two things. One, I have a second screen with the chat open. So as I'm talking, if you have questions or you have comments or you want me to explain something again, like please put it in the chat. This is an interactive presentation. But two, I want to acknowledge that we've all probably been sitting for 2, maybe even 3 hours today. So I just want to pause for a second and give everyone a second to stand up, stretch, and like a big stretch. If you do breathing exercises, now is a good time for like a fourfold breath or something like that. There is some social science research that suggests that kind of stressful conversations, and I know what I'm going to be talking about is like really light and fluffy stuff like racism and homophobia and sexism and things like that. That it's easier to do if you can reset your limbic system before you start talking, and things like fourfold breathing is really helpful for that. So as I pull up to share my screen, please take a second and just, stretch it out. Remind yourself that you're a person with a body, and that is okay. Let's see. So hopefully now you can all see my screen. And yeah. And you can see that today we're going to rustle some jimmies. So today I'm hoping to give a primer on anti-oppressive frameworks in the Paraweird, or extra normal or paranormal or mystical or magical. I know that there are a lot of really great words that people can use, and a lot of really different words that mean different things to different people. So I want to acknowledge all of them as a part of this framework. So to kind of kick us off, I want to acknowledge that today I'm speaking to you from central or west central Florida, which is land that's been traditionally occupied, or that's occupied in the traditional lands of the Seminole people, and pay my respects to elders both in the past and in the present. And the reason why I think that that's so important to acknowledge is, first of all, all of us who live in North America and really all of the Americas, but even many people who live across the world, in sort of in Europe and Asia, certainly many people who live in the Pacific Islands and in Australia and New Zealand, as well as in Africa, live in places where the indigenous people of those lands are no longer the part of the dominant power structure. So it's important as we're talking about anti-oppression to acknowledge the people who maybe have been pushed off their land, but also as people who engage with the paranormal, that this is a way that we can build a really broad concept of spirits of place. That, the liminal earth folks last night were talking about how spirits of place can be the spirits of not just the land and all of the plants and all of the animals, but also the people and the buildings, and that we should extend that back into the past too. And that part of having really full experiences of the paranormal, the paraweird, the magical, the mystical, can be about engaging with the past and engaging with the peoples of the past on the place that you're at. And right now, I think part of an important way of engaging with the people and the place that I live in now is to talk about what happened this week here in Florida, and that's talk about Hurricane Ian. So these are two pictures of the same couple of blocks in Fort Myers Beach, Florida, which is down on the southwestern end of the Florida Peninsula. The first picture on the left is a picture of from Google Earth, and then on the right is a picture from Thursday. So as you can see, like that community, which is right on the Gulf, has really been absolutely devastated by the hurricane making landfall just a little bit north of where this picture was taken. And here we have a map of like a sort of a broader map of Southwest Florida. All of the area in blue that you can see are places where the storm surge was at least 6 feet. So if you see the big clusters of land, the one that's all the way on the left, that's Port Charlotte. Then next is Cape Coral, which is the biggest city in Southwest Florida. There are about 400,000 people who live there. Fort Myers is right on the other side of that river. And then down at the end, that's Naples. There are about 1.2 million people who live in that stretch of Southwest Florida, and that black line with the arrow on it, that's where the hurricane actually, like the center of the hurricane made landfall. So obviously there are a ton of people who, and a ton of animals and other more than human entities that would have been impacted by this. So as a part of talking about, thinking about the world and thinking about the paranormal from a lens of anti-oppression, I think it's important to acknowledge that the things that happen in our world have different kinds of impacts on people. This part of Florida is more likely to be occupied by older people. And certainly being elderly in our society comes with its own set of challenges and its own set of oppressions. So I wanted to just call attention to a couple of ways that people can help out. And I'm going to put a link to my blog in the chat here in a second with links to these 4 organizations. But these 4 organizations are coming at providing hurricane relief from a lens of anti-oppression, which I know I keep saying anti-oppression. Trust me, I'm going to explain what that means here in a second. Central Florida Mutual Aid is obviously thinking more about the Orlando area, but they also have had some pretty extreme flooding. Roots of Hope is a Cuban organization that's attempting to build power amongst millennial-aged Cubans. And while I'm talking a lot about Florida, Hurricane Ian first made landfall on the planet in Cuba. And there was one point at which nobody on the island of Cuba had power. That situation has kind of been resolved, but there's still a long road ahead for recovery in Western Cuba as well. Feeding America is another great organization to support. They are a national organization in the United States that runs food banks and helps make sure that food banks have what they need to provide people with food assistance, with the ultimate goal of ending hunger in the United States. And the Dream Defenders are running some recovery efforts out of Miami. And they've done some amazing organizing throughout the country, creating power in Black communities all across the country. So again, I'll put some links to these resources in the chat, and also some other resources that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I wasn't necessarily planning on talking about that until yesterday, but it really struck me that I couldn't talk about anti-oppression without talking about something really important where a lot of people are going to need some help that's happening right in my backyard. So a little bit about me. Like I said, my name is Nick. I use they, them pronouns. I live in West Central Florida. I'm sure you can tell if you are able to see my face that I'm a Black person. I'm 33 years old. I am agender. I'm also a queer person. I identify as bisexual. I'm originally from the city of Chicago, the best and the only city on the planet. Um, I am a disabled person. I'm also married to a disabled person. I consider myself a paraweirdo. I went to and graduated from college. We have a cat, Marcy, who you met earlier. Um, and I live in a multi-generational household right now. Leslie and I are staying with her parents and her uncle. Um, and I point all these things out just to sort of set the stage for the fact that um, these are all important parts of the way that I view the world and the way that I view the paranormal. That I cannot separate how I think about myself or how I um, think about aliens or Bigfoot or professional football or movies or anything from my blackness or my queerness or the fact that I went to college and I have all this weird specialized knowledge in political science because I went to college and studied political science. So I want to give you all just a few minutes. If you have some paper, go ahead and write it down. If you don't, just go ahead and kind of think about it or pull up something on your computer to type some thoughts. And just jot down a couple of things that you know are important to your own personal lens of thinking about the world. Awesome. So there's a sociological term that we can use that I think is helpful to hear. All of these things wrap up to talk about one's social location, and I'm going to use the concept of social location a couple of times as we move forward. And specifically, what social location is it's the social position that any individual has within their society that's based upon social characteristics that are deemed important by that society. So we live in the United States. Gender and race are, I think, the two most important pieces of social location that everybody has. Age is another one. But again, things like marital status, disability status, whether or not you went to college, where you live, how long you've lived where you live, if you live where you were born, or if you live far away from where you were born. All of those sorts of things wrap into social location. And it's really important that we all have some awareness of our social location as we think about how we interact with each other, but also how we think about how we interact with the mystical, the magical, the more than human, the paranormal, the paraweird, etc. So this chart is a chart that I use in my day-to-day work. I should back up. I'm a professional diversity and inclusion advocate. So I talk a lot about a lot of these concepts in my professional life as well. And this is a chart that I use to talk about identity in the context of diversity. That kind of lays out how different pieces of identity layer on top of each other. So everybody has aspects of their identity that fall into each of these groups in this target. So if you start at the center and work your way out, the things that are the closest to the center are the things that are the hardest to change. In fact, the things that are in the center are things that you cannot consciously change. And what I would just point out about the inclusion of gender identity and sexual orientation, is that when we talk about those things as being unchanging, it's not that you cannot have you cannot explore your relationships to those things. It's not that you cannot go through multiple labels throughout your life or have different understandings, but it's that the label and the understanding is the thing that changes, not actually like what your like innate experience is. So just I'll use myself as an example. I came out as agender a year and a half ago, so not that long ago. That always was true about me. I just did not understand that until relatively recently, and then to be able to put it in words to other people came even later than that. Um, the secondary characteristics, those are things that they can change, but they're very much so like sort of personal internal views. The things on this chart in this organizational section, they're obviously things that are talking about this from the lens of being in a company, but you can kind of change these categories a little bit to be more about your status in a group. So rather than talking about union affiliation, it might be about a affiliation with another group that's sort of the same or similar. When we talk about work experience, maybe this is about how much you've gone ghost hunting, or how many experiences you've had or how many rituals you've participated in. And then when we talk about cultural, this isn't like cultural in terms of like I'm an American, so American culture. This is about cultural in the concept of or in the context of a specific group. So a good example is that it is a cultural norm in the group of people who watch the television show Ghost Adventures to say that many things that seem to be malevolent are a demon, whether or not that's true. So that's sort of what we should be thinking about when we think about culture. All right, so I used the phrase diversity and inclusion. I'm going to use the full phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's in my job title. I want to talk just a little bit about what that means and what we're talking about when we use that phrase, so that I can contrast it with talking about anti-oppression. So each of those three words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are doing something really, really specific. The first one is diversity. So diversity refers to the differences between different individuals based on any attribute that may lead to a perception that that person is different from someone else. So a thing that people will say and do a lot that really, really grates at the back of my brain is that they will talk about people as diverse. No one is diverse. Groups are diverse. I am not a diverse person because I'm Black or because I'm queer or because I'm disabled. I am a queer, Black, disabled person. If there are other queer, Black, disabled people in a group with people who are not Black, not queer, not disabled, then that's talking about the diversity in the group from that lens. When we talk about then equity, what we're talking about is a form of equality. It's relative, that takes into consideration what different people need, what the situation is, and the circumstances that result in people having disparate outcomes. So giving them what they need, essentially, to kind of reach a similar or the same outcome. That's different than equality. And I have this like handy dandy picture here. I'm going to focus on those middle two pieces. Equality gives everybody the same thing and assumes that everybody having the same thing is going to somehow lead to a good outcome. But as you can see here, from these three people trying to watch this baseball game, that the shortest person getting the same size box as the tallest person didn't actually need a box in the first place. The shortest person needs a box considerably bigger than that so that they can see the baseball game. So that shortest person is still end up being left out. Whereas in an equity framework, the tallest person doesn't need anything, so we don't give them anything. The shortest person needs two boxes, and the person who's middle sized only needs one box. Now they can all see it, and that's great. And inclusion is the extent to which people can have access to whatever it is that they need, so that they can participate as fully as they want to, that they can influence decision making, and that they can truly feel a part of the organization, or a part of whatever it is that's happening. I think that there's a third concept here too, and it's actually, to me in this graphic, I would reverse them. Sorry, I did not mean to go backwards. Let me go back here. Cool. In this graphic, I think that the two concepts are mixed up. There's justice and there's inclusion. To me, inclusion is about everybody being able to see or being able to participate, because we've changed kind of the script a little bit. And justice is really where we are getting full participation from everybody in every sort of way. So in this case of this baseball idea, justice is even asking, does everybody really want to play baseball? Or do we maybe want to play a different game? Do we need to stop for a second? Things like that. So there's this concept. I don't know why it keeps going too many slides forward. So I've used the phrase anti-oppressive framework a couple times here. So anti-oppressive frameworks, this is a method for really thinking about how systems of oppression result both in individual discrimination and individual acts of discrimination, but also structural and systemic inequality. So there are three things really that we're thinking about here when we think about anti-oppression that are laid out in this handy dandy chart here. So we're thinking about individual action, institutional barriers, and ideology. So individual action, that's pretty straightforward. That's what individual people are doing to individually do whatever they need to do. Institutional barriers are the kinds of things that organizations or that groups of people do together and set up to either keep people out or sometimes keep people in a group. And then ideology are the ways of thinking about both the group and the outside world. And each of those sort of tent poles, if you will, all create a very, very specific kind of oppression. So individual action is what you're thinking about when you're thinking about a hate crime. It's saying something hurtful or saying something othering, doing something that's cruel or mean. Institutional barriers are things like saying that you need to pay money in order to get into something, in an effort to leave some people out who can't afford the thing, or a poll tax or a literacy test, things like that. And then ideology is, like I said, the kinds of ways that people think. So having the broad framework in your brain that all Black people are lazy, or that gay men are all effeminate, or things like that you might not necessarily say, but you're thinking it and you're holding on to it. And here again, ideology is not just the way that one person thinks, it's the way that lots of people think. So here, the thing at the center here is the concept of power. And I just want to kind of think a little bit about power, but I want to think about power a little bit circuitously here. So there's two big definitions that I think a lot of people in our weirdo communities use to talk about magic. One by our friend on the left, Aleister Crowley, that magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And then on the right, we have Dion Fortune, who talked about magic as being the art of changing consciousness according to will. And I think that those are both, I think, fantastic ways of thinking about what magic is. But I also think that they're really good ways of thinking about what power is. So the guy in the middle is kind of the grandfather of sociology, Max Weber, and he defined power as the ability to exercise one's will over others. So much of what we talk about when we're talking, especially in a contemporary sense, where we don't really believe that we're like those of us who believe in magic or practice magic, don't really believe that we're like Gandalf and that we can shoot fireballs out of our hands, or that we can summon a Frost Atronach to come and wreck somebody's house or something like that. That often what we're talking about when we talk about magic is really talking about the conscious wielding of power, either on ourselves in the Dion Fortune sense, to kind of change the way that we are thinking and even maybe acting in conformity with our personal will, or in Crowley's case, that we're creating some sort of change either within ourselves or in the external world to make all of those things align with our true will or our pure will. That sort of framework, I think, is really helpful just in terms of considering the fact that how effective one's magic might be impacted by how much power they have relative to other people. So just as an example, if you are a straight, cis, white guy from a middle or upper middle class background who lives in the Northeast, or lives in California, or lives in Western Europe, and lives inside of a city or maybe in the suburbs, that your ability to actually practice magic in a lot of the sort of contemporary sense of the way that we use the concept of magic may be really, really different than sort of someone living in sub-Saharan Africa, or than someone who lives in the same environment as you do, but who is queer, or who is disabled, or who is trans. So even just that one concept, power, can affect something really simple like, how do you practice magic? What does magic look like to you? What does a result from a magical working look like for you? So that's just one really, really basic way that this framework can apply to the paranormal. So again, anti-oppressive framework, we're going to really dig into what this is. This is really going to be the meat here of this presentation, is working through what exactly the framework is for taking this power chart that we have here and dismantling it. Because obviously, I think everybody here, I think we're all on the same page that oppression is bad. If you're not, I would like you to just hang in there with me for a second. We're going to assume that oppression is bad. So that should probably be something that we would like to fix. Before I kind of get into what specifically makes up an anti-oppression framework, I think it's important to kind of lay out a couple of key ways. I'm just checking the chat just to make sure I'm not missing anybody or anything. Perfect. I think it's important to lay out that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's its own framework, and it's different from anti-oppression. So the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, that's what I do in my job that pays me money so that I can do things. Anti-oppression, if I'm being really, really honest, is more of my personal framework for how I look at the world, and they're separate. So diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks often center privileged classes, whether it's centering the viewpoints of white people, straight people, cis people, and here cis, I should be clear to explain, is sort of the opposite of being trans. So a cisgender person is a person whose gender identity aligns with the gender that they were assigned when they were born. A trans person is a person whose gender identity does not align with someone who with the gender that they were assigned when they were born. Anti-oppression really centers the experience and the understanding of oppressed classes, whether it is, again, people of color, trans people, queer, other kinds of queer people, people who are from rural areas, poor people, people who have body sizes that are either they are fat or they are very skinny. There are a ton of other different ways that people can hold oppression. Another way that these two frameworks are different, diversity, equity, and inclusion is often not very concerned with the way that power works. It doesn't give like a full analysis of like how and why power works the way that it does. Is really a framework that just says, so power is working. We know that it exists. It's not important to talk about it, but what is important is to say that like everybody should like treat each other better. So given that people should treat each other better, like how do we get there? Whereas anti-oppression is really built around an analysis of power, which obviously we talked about power. That's why I spent so much time talking about power, is that all of this really does center around like both thinking about how personally and individually we hold power, how we're using that power, and what we can do to change that if we recognize that that is not the best. Obviously, the word equity is in that diversity, equity, and inclusion label, so it's very equity focused. Anti-oppression frameworks are really justice focused. The difference between equity and justice, I kind of hit on this before, but just to hit it home, is kind of the difference between telling someone that they are invited to a dinner party and that they are, when they get to the dinner party, that they're allowed to pick the music, they're allowed to have input on the menu. They can certainly eat as much as they want to feel full. And so that's what equity looks like. And in a justice framework, we're even starting from like, have you been invited to a dinner party before? Do you know what a dinner party is? Can we explain that to you? Do we even ask you, do you want to go to a dinner party in the first place? And then working from there and giving you enough input that if you're like, actually, I would rather go eat in a restaurant, that then there's a mechanism for asking that for sort of checking in with everybody who was invited to the dinner party to see if maybe going to a restaurant actually would be better. The last big distinction I would make here is that diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks are often really concerned with social identities that aren't linked to oppression. So like I talked about being a pet parent in a diversity framework, like that's interesting and something we should talk a lot about. In my like paid work, I talk a lot about parents and what parents need. But I also talk a lot about how we have to make space for our friends who are straight white guys, because they're a part of the group too, and they're a part of a diverse community. And I think that that's true, and I think that that's good. But an anti-oppression framework, which is more of what I use to like look at the world personally, starts from a place of thinking only about social identities that are linked to oppression. So we're only thinking about sort of race, we're thinking about gender identity, gender expression, we're thinking about sexuality, we're thinking about religion, but we're only thinking about religion in certain kinds of contexts. If we're thinking about geography, we're thinking about geography in a very, very specific kind of way. But we're maybe not thinking about, what do you like to do for a hobby? Unless part of what you like to do for a hobby is linked really strongly to your race or your gender or things like that. So I want to pause and make sure that I'm keeping up with the chat. If you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat. I see, Kai, you said these distinctions are so important and very eye-opening as a person who spends a lot of time in largely white-aligned DEI, nonprofit political spaces. Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways that spaces that are dominated by people from privileged groups do often use more of a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion lens than the anti-oppression lens. And it's not always intentional. Sometimes it's just, a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens is how most people think about these people differences, because I don't want to say that it's comfortable, because that sounds dismissive, but it's a little bit easier to see how everybody gets to participate. So what does this have to do with aliens or ghosts or magic or Bigfoot or stuff like this? Ultimately, everything that we talk about when we talk about the paranormal, and I forget who said this earlier, but this has, to me, been a running theme over the last couple of days, is that all this stuff is about people and it's about culture. So ultimately, if you can't talk about the ways that people experience mundane things and how that's different, then I can't even begin to understand how you would be able to talk about how people experience weird stuff, like the fact that they think that their experience is that they're talking to their dead grandma, or that they are talking to beings from another planet, or who maybe are from a different time, or things like that we have a harder time explaining. Also, identity has so much of an impact on who's treated as respectable, and whose experiences and whose perspectives are able to be believed. It is impossible for me to believe that it is a coincidence that when we think about who gets to be treated as a credible experiencer of alien phenomena, whether it's people who are abductees or who've seen a UFO, that the list of people who's credible, if you go down it, it's a lot of dudes, it's a lot of white people, it's a lot of upper middle class, middle class, and then upper class people who are taken super seriously. And that's, regardless of where you are in the world. In the United States, we almost exclusively talk about alien abduction experiences from people from the United States and Canada, and maybe the UK, but we really don't talk too much about folks in Central Africa or in South Asia, or in the Asian Pacific who have had these experiences. And as far as we know, they've probably had them too. We just don't talk about them because those sorts of people are lower on the power rung in the United States, so they aren't thought of as quite as respectable. But also, kind of related to that, a lot of our phenomena might be culturally contingent. So here, what this means is that is two things. So one is that when people have experiences, they run them through the lens of their culture and what they can understand. So some of why, just to keep with the aliens example, some of why we may not hear so much about people from, we'll keep talking about people from South Asia talking about UFOs, is because there may be some different conception of what that experience is. such that they're not articulating it as seeing UFOs or aliens. Maybe they're talking about seeing a deity, or they're talking about seeing an angel or some other culturally specific phenomena that they understand that we may not. Or that they might use a specific word that we in the West don't have to explain that same concept. So we hear reports about something and we're just like, all right, well, that's not aliens, so it's not aliens. But the other, more, I think, weirdo way of thinking about this is that certain phenomena may actually only appear to people from specific cultural backgrounds because people of that cultural background are capable of groping what the thing is. And that's not coming from a place of sort of some people are better than others. But again, if you don't have the mental map to be able to understand the concept of little green men coming in a metal craft from somewhere up there down here and having interactions with people, then maybe the phenomena just won't appear to you. And the last big thing, I think, is that all of these modes of oppression that we're talking about here, they impact the way that people have access to resources in space. So I kind of alluded to this in the panel discussion on Friday, that a lot of the sites that we do investigations of, whether we're looking for Bigfoot or looking for ghosts or going alien hunting, or even certain schools of magic when they do rituals, the spaces that these things occur in are often spaces that everyone doesn't have the same amount of access to. Some of this is about needing to be able to pay to be in a space, but some of it is totally about just like, is it comfortable to be a trans person who maybe doesn't pass super well, going into a rural community in West Virginia? Is it super comfortable to be East Asian in a rural community in lots of places in the United States? Is it comfortable being a woman in a group of being the only woman in a group of men? Or even, is it comfortable being a Black person and going into an abandoned building? If you are a person who needs mobility aids, can you physically get into a cave? And even if you can get in, can you get out? So all of these things impact the way that we can show up, the way that we can do investigations, things like that. So anti-oppression the framework can kind of be laid out like a circle, and it's a circle on purpose. I'm going to lay these things out individually, but it's really important to not think of them as like step 1, step 2, step 3, where you address your biases, and then you centralize marginal voices, and then you think about issues of mental health. You should always be doing all 7 of these, and you will be doing all 7 of these forever. This is not this isn't a recipe where you follow it and then eventually you're done. This is a journey where the important thing is the journey and not the destination. One thing that I talk a lot about in my work is that just if you think about a relatively like mainstream normie person, to them, like, gay people maybe were invented in the 80s, trans people were invented like 5 years ago. We know that people from those communities have been around forever. But in a mainstream sense, and for lots of individual people, they don't have awareness of different groups of people, and that's going to keep happening. We're going to keep having new groups of people as the world is made more safe to share certain kinds of experiences. as we continue to have interactions with each other and kind of come up with new ways of interacting with each other and interacting with the world, but also in coming up with new ways of making distinctions between me and not me, that we'll consistently have to do this work forever. So once you commit to this, like, you're never going to be done, which is fine. It's a part of, to me, a part of staying curious and being curious. So to get into some of these individually, so building inclusive communities, I think this is the most straightforward of all of them. Here, this is where we're intentionally developing space where people can feel safe and respected, and being themselves and expressing every part of their identity. And everybody has multiple parts of their identity. So a inclusive community isn't inclusive if you have created space where people feel totally open to being queer, but they're still worried about being impacted by racism. An inclusive space isn't good if it's a safe space for people to be women, and specifically here we'll say cis women, but they don't feel comfortable being honest about how much access to resources they have because they're poor or because they're really rich. So I like this like really weird drawing that I found of these different cryptids all hanging out around this maypole with this giant squid, because I think it really highlights the idea that even in the paranormal, we can still think about this just in terms of the paranormal, that an inclusive paranormal community should include occultists and occultists who practice multiple different types of occultism. So occultisms, plural. It should include witches and other magic users. It should include or be inclusive for sort of nuts and bolts ufology types, but also people who have some maybe less hyper rationalist ways of thinking about what aliens are. It should include Bigfoot hunters and people who practice other kinds of cryptozoology. It should include people who are psychics and mediums and do parapsychology. It should include people who come from all sorts of different backgrounds, in addition to the identity pieces of being able to be a person of color, or being able to be queer, or being able to be disabled in whatever way you're disabled, and that the space is safe and respected, or that there's space for people to feel safe and respected because of all of those things. The next thing that I want to talk about, and the next kind of big component, is addressing and challenging implicit biases. So implicit biases are the attitudes that we individually have, but aren't really necessarily conscious of. So really, we want to make sure that we're thinking through how we make opportunities for people to both identify the biases that they have and then interrogate them, to really like say, like, do I believe this thing because it is true and it is a relatively universal experience, or that it is based very heavily in my individual lived experience, or do I believe this because somebody told it to me and I don't know any better, or somebody told it to me and I haven't had an opportunity to really push back. And I think that thinking about ghost adventures is like a super easy way to talk about implicit bias in two different ways. And this might be challenging, so just hold on to your butts. So obviously, Zach Bagans and the rest of the Ghost Adventures crew, they have some really specific views about ghosts and demons and the paranormal in general. And I think that none of them have really had anybody push back on any of those things. And they haven't really been given the chance to question a lot of those biases that they have against certain kinds of activity and certain kinds of phenomena. And I think that that's a really good way of talking about implicit bias. But the more challenging way to put this is that I'm pretty sure that everybody who's watching this talk right now saw that picture of those four dudes and had like a gut level reaction to the four of them. And I think that it's important for all of us to think about those four men, and Zach Bagans specifically, and to really challenge whether or not that bias, either if it was a positive one, if you were like, yeah, Zach, it's great, or if you were like, I think most of us, and you were like, not for me, or something more negative than that, where that feeling comes from. And if that feeling is coming from a place of saying, I disagree with his approach, and that's sort of it, or if there was sort of a gut level implicit reaction to either something about his identity. I mean, when we talk about his approach to the paranormal, there are pieces of identity that are wrapped up in that we are talking about Christians, a very specific kind of Christian, either Catholic or like certain kinds of Protestant ways of thinking about the way that that the world is ordered and the way that humans interact with the more than human, and to challenge whether your reaction to Zach Bagans is about him and things that he has specifically done, or if it's a reaction to your individual feelings about Catholicism or about Christianity or about white men. So I'll just let everybody sit in that for a second. The next component, challenging power and privilege. Here, it's so important that we all understand both personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels of power, and then privilege. And privilege in this framework is necessarily being a person who comes from a group that historically and contemporarily holds more power than any other group. And then the next part of that is then making sure that you're being intentional to dismantle all of that, throughout all different modes of oppression. So, I mean, a good question to ask yourself and to ask others, is where it is that you feel like you have power over others, and then how the behaviors that you do reinforce that power difference, or where what it is that you do sort of breaks up that power difference. I think that in the sort of the framework of the paranormal here, really this is just about like really being open to the idea that if somebody is saying like, hey, the way that you're talking about this phenomena really like is really racist, is being open to the idea that that's true and then following that conversation where it should go, but also being really willing to say to someone, hey, this doesn't necessarily impact me directly because of my identity, but like the way that we're talking about Kabbalah right now, is really anti-Semitic. So like, let's stop doing that. Or this framework that we're using of talking about magic as being like gendered, that there's masculine and feminine energy, like that's super cis sexist. It's very transphobic, but it also erases people who aren't men or women. Let's stop doing that. And then thinking about what do I believe, or what do you, as an individual, that reinforces my personal power as a white person, as a man, as a cis person, as a upper middle class person. There are, again, lots of ways to think about this. I'll pause for a second. I know I've been talking for a second, so I want to make sure It doesn't look like there are any questions in the chat, but please feel free if you have questions to put those in the chat. The next thing I want to talk about is centering marginalized voices. So here again, it's making sure that we're not just making space for, but also like intentionally giving a platform to oppressed or marginalized people to be able to share, contribute, lead, and be heard as much as they want to. So part of this is actively making a space for a person of color, making space for women, for trans people, for non-binary people, for people who aren't Christian, for people who are all sorts of pagan, to be able to talk on whatever it is that we're talking on, and to be able to participate in a group activity or a convention or whatever as much as they'd like to. But also part of this is thinking about if you are from a privileged or a dominant group, thinking about where it might be a good idea to stop talking, to give someone else a chance to lead, to maybe hold back a contribution long enough to give other people the opportunity to contribute. And here it bothers, I think is the right word, bothers me so much that like the prototypical modern experiencer experience came from a Black man and a white woman who were in an interracial marriage before interracial marriage was legal everywhere in the United States. And I mean, I'll put it this way too, a Black man who lived in New Hampshire, like that's not something you hear about very often. But I've never heard anybody, and this might be a reflection of my own not being as well read as I wish I was. I've never heard anybody talk about Barney Hill's experience with UFOs from the lens of his Blackness. And I've never heard anybody like really interrogate what it means that like, again, like the archetype, the classic case of a UFO abduction coming from a Black person and coming from a white woman who's married to a Black person. So just as much as, you know, this is about making space for people, just as much as it's about thinking about stepping back, this is also a great time to bring in the idea that we should all be always thinking about whose voice aren't we hearing from? In the case of Barney and Betty Hill, why don't we hear very much from Barney Hill specifically? Now, I know that there are answers to that question, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I want to talk about today. But like, again, who aren't we hearing from? To go backwards, why do we not hear very much from experiencers who are South Asian? What are the barriers that we put in place for people to share their experiences? Why aren't we listening to certain people? Are certain people talking, but they're not talking in a place that we're looking to hear them talk? These are all sort of great questions. Embedding intersectionality is really important too. Intersectionality is a concept that was developed by a law professor in the 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw. And basically what intersectionality means is that everyone has multiple identities, and their experience is impacted by not just one, but all of their identities. And you cannot separate out their experience as one of those identities from their experience as another one. So those either oppressions or privileges layer on top of each other. So the classic example to talk about is that Black women experience the world both as Black people, so they experience all of the oppression of racism and anti-Black racism specifically, but also all of the oppression of being a woman, and that those two things inform each other, to really say like the experience of racism of Black women is different than the experience of racism of Black men, and that the experience of sexism that Black women have is different than the experience of sexism that white women have. So it's so important that we think about and kind of understand how complex identity is and how those complex identities really inform how we think about institutional barriers, how we think about how individuals treat each other, but also how we think about how individuals interact with systems. I have this picture that I found that every time I look at it is just like the funniest picture ever, that came from an article talking about whether or not Bigfoot is the ghost of a Neanderthal man. And I think that it's that just from a paranormal lens, that as we have more interesting and exciting lenses to think about phenomena, that we have to bring in all of the pieces of that together. So if Bigfoot is a ghost of Neanderthal man, like then we have to talk about the ghost part, but we also have to talk about the Neanderthal part, and we can't separate those two things, and they also inform each other. So I mean, like obviously we're all Homo sapiens. I believe we're all Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals, like that's a completely different experience of just like being on Earth. The way that they had language was different. The way that their physiology works is different too. That might account for some of why Bigfoot works the way that it does, but it's also a ghost. So maybe that's why we've never found a body. That's sort of the framework that we want to use there to think about this. So again, just from a what does this have to do with the paranormal lens? We can use this to be a little bit more complicated and a little bit more thoughtful in how we talk about some phenomena. But it's also really important that we think about how intersectionality impacts who is able to show up in what kinds of spaces. So as an example, if we've only done a lot to think about making sure that women are comfortable in a space, then that probably means that the only women who will show up are, or most of the women who show up are white. Most of them are probably cis. Most of them are probably able-bodied. They're also mostly probably people who are women who are either middle class or upper middle class or above. So as we're thinking about creating safe space for people, we have to think through all of the barriers. We have to think about all of the ways that intersectionality impacts them. So there are two more components here. Mobilizing for systemic change. This is just making sure that you're actually taking action against discrimination and oppression, and that the actions that you take both address individual behaviors, so both like calling out individual people's racism, sexism, etc., or pushing people out of a group who are bigots, but also thinking about social and institutional change. So, I think we have a concept in occultism and in witchcraft of people being armchair magicians or armchair witches, and there are certainly people who are like armchair anti-oppression advocates, that they've done all the reading, they know the 1619 Project and Isabel Wilkerson's cast and all of these other great things, and they have all of this formal training, and then they do nothing with it. So when you're around them, they're still letting people use slurs. They're still letting people get away with like not challenging their biases, but they're also never really thinking about how they vote. Maybe they don't vote, and maybe they don't vote not because they're saying I'm choosing not to participate in the system, which I think that's a cop out anyway, but whatever, not important. But they don't vote because they just like, I have other things to do on a Tuesday, or I have other things to do on the day that I vote in wherever I live. Maybe they're the sorts of people who they never really think about how the companies that they support, what sort of business practices those companies put into place, or they don't think about who they choose to give attention to on social media, because it's like it's all fake, it's all ephemera, it's all nothing. So it's important to really think through what pathways exist within the things that you do individually to mobilize, not just for changes to individual people's behavior, but also that big systemic change. And the last piece, I think it's really important to talk about mental health and mental wellness, and actually physical wellness too, as a part of anti-oppressive frameworks. We know that everything is harder when you're sick. Whether the way that you're sick is that you have a sort of a physical illness, or you are dealing with depression or pathological anxiety, or whatever it is, but that those specific experiences both are created by and create their own kinds of oppression. So we know, just as an example, and the immediate past president of Howard University, his research, he's a medical doctor, his research was into the physical health impacts of racism. We know that racism makes Black people sicker, and other people of color. It makes them continually being exposed to racism. It raises people's blood pressure permanently, which is part of why hypertension is a big issue amongst communities of color. That it leads to heightened levels of like permanent and clinical forms of anxiety, that it's more likely to lead to depression, and that ultimately all of those things are bad for your health. But we also know that there is a whole set of oppressions that people who have mental illness or who have mental disorders experience, that all loop into sort of the disability conversation. And that being a person from a marginalized background also impacts how able you are to access resources for mental health and wellness. So in a paranormal context, all of that is really big stuff that's really hard, right? What does this have to do with ghosts? The line between I had an experience where I saw a ghost and I have a mental disorder where sometimes I enter into psychosis and I see things or I hear things, and I know that they're not there, or I'm fairly certain that they're not there, but I don't know. The line between that is a lot less fine than I think many of us would want it to be. So again, how does not just being a person who experiences psychosis, but also being someone who is a trans person, or who's a sex worker, or again, who's a person of color, like how do all of those things fit together to talk about whether or not we believe someone when they say, I saw a ghost, versus saying, you're crazy, get away from me. And then in the context of being a paranormal investigator, at a certain point, we do have to tell some people, I know what you're saying you experienced. I don't disbelieve you in that you experienced that. I just don't think that this is the right explanation. is when we give that when we sort of make that analysis, is that impacted by race, gender, keep going down the list, um, versus us saying, you sound pretty crazy, but like, I still think you're onto something. Um, so again, just so important to be thinking about mental health and wellness in the sort of the bigger framework of anti-oppression. So these are just some questions that I thought are really good for people to kick around. Um, you know, there are so many ways in which this framework can really inform the way that we all think about all of the weirdo stuff that we love, that we were here this weekend talking about, thinking about the way that we use language to describe phenomena and how that might make an environment less safe for some people who have identities that are different than us, or how it might make an environment more safe. Thinking about who we think is a credible experiencer, or even where we think to look for experiencers or stories about weird stuff, and how that might prevent us from really having a full experience of a certain kind of phenomena, is all tied back into this anti-oppression framework. Obviously, we're having this conference. I think that Vanessa and Mary and Jason really did a great job of bringing together a diverse group of speakers. But I think it's still there to be asked, like, who's not in the room? Who's not getting the mic today or over this weekend? And as we go to other Paracons, or we're doing group investigations, or we're involved in magical orders or magical circles or things like that, who's getting to talk? Who's setting the agenda? And then again, who's not in the room at all versus who's in the room but an observer rather than as a participant. And then kind of the last thing that I really want to just bring to the fore is how do all of these concepts of privilege and intersectionality inform as we think about making progress in the Paraweird? How do they inform which concepts or which techniques that we either decide to take in and use as something new, or discard and say this is garbage? And are we discarding traditional indigenous practices because it's not as cool as a K2 eater? Or are we throwing away a piece of technology in favor of something maybe more magical or more mystical that it turns out was invented by a trans person or by a person of color? And are we more comfortable doing that because it came from someone of a marginalized background? So sort of to kind of wrap up here, I wanted to share a couple of resources for thinking about anti-oppressive frameworks. That first resource is really the thing I want to shout out the hardest. Anti-Oppressive Framework, a primer, is a tool developed by the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, which is the teachers union in Ontario, Canada. Large parts of the way that I structured this came from that primer. It is phenomenal. Again, it was written to be easy to understand for elementary school teachers. So not necessarily people with master's degrees in sociology or philosophy or political science or any of the kinds of stuff that people spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff often come from. So if you are looking for one thing to look at to kind of dig into this a little bit harder, or to share this stuff with other people, that's the place to go. The University of Nebraska Omaha also has a really nice resource guide from their library that collates a bunch of different books, articles, podcasts, TV shows, some movies, other things like that, that specifically talk to anti-racism, anti-ableism, They use a phrase that I want to make sure that I'm using the exact right phrase here. They use the phrase anti-queermesia rather than like homophobia or transphobia. The reason why they use that phrase, and I think that this is really interesting and has started to inform how I speak, is that the phobia suffix talks about being afraid of something. The mesia ending means that you hate something. So here, their framework is really focused on talking about how people, not how people push back against fear of queer people, but how people push back against hate of queer people. And same thing with trans people. So that's a great resource too. The map that I showed at the very beginning with the different native groups that are indigenous to Florida is from Native Land Digital. That's a cool tool too. You can type in an address and they'll show you all of the native people in North America who have traditional lands for where that address is. And then the last two are podcasts. Intersectionality Matters is a podcast that Kimberly Crenshaw hosts, where she's really talking through like what intersectionality actually looks like. She's super dynamic and super interesting. And again, intersectionality, it was her brain baby. So she's definitely somebody to listen to. And the last one, I'm a huge advocate of public radio. And NPR has a podcast that's also got some other stuff, Code Switch, that just talks about race, but they talk about race from an intersectional lens. I think they do a really good job of not just talking about Black people when they talk about race. So they also talk about the racial experience of people from all across the continent of Asia. They talk about Latinx people. When they talk about Black people, they talk not just about the American descendants of Black chattel slavery, but they also talk about Afro-Caribbean people and recent African immigrants. They talk about the experience of Black people living in Europe and other parts of the world too. It's super good. It's on NPR, so it's like not like stuff that's super simple, but they make it pretty easy for folks too. So with that, I think I'm done.